The Sunday school lessons for July 28th, 2024 are expectant watchfulness and God redeems us. Psalm 130. Welcome, viewers and subscribers, to my channel, Read With Me. I am Audrey. If you are new here, please know that this is an audio reading of the lesson with intermittent commentary. Let me personally thank those of you who gave me a thumbs up on the very last audio that I released. Please continue to do so that the YouTube algorithm will continue to push out my audio. And also, please know that every Sunday at 1 o'clock Central Standard Time, I release an audio for the upcoming Sunday school lesson. Thank you so much for all that you do to help this channel grow one viewer and one subscriber at a time. Verses 1 through 3. Out of the depths I cry to you, Lord. The phrase out of the depths might be a shorter form of the phrase the depths of the water. Ezekiel chapter 27, verse 34. Isaiah 51:10 speaks of the depths of the sea. While the Hebrew word here translated depths only occurs in these instances in the Bible, images of the watery deep were frequently used as an image of danger or chaos, especially the horror of drowning. Exodus chapter 15, verse 5, Psalm 69, verse 2. Additionally, the concept of death is linked to Sheol, the place of the dead. Depths and Sheol should not be conflated, but neither should the possible link between them be neglected. Like Jonah crying from the belly of the great fish, Jonah chapter 2, verses 2 through 5, the psalmist here speaks metaphorically of having descended to the realm of death, to Sheol. Though not an equivalent of the place we call hell, Sheol was under the earth and generally considered far from God's presence. Numbers chapter 16, verses 30 through 33, Psalm 6, verse 5. No one worshiped God there. These characteristics of Sheol give insight into what death entailed to ancient Israelites' way of thinking. The cry from the gates of the realm of death, Sheol itself, points to the many sorts of problems humans may face, including our mortality and proneness to sickness, as well as the hostile attitudes of wicked people or the irresistible power of some historical or natural events. The depths may take many forms. From there, the psalmist now addresses God in hopes of being heard and saved. Psalm 49, verse 15. A call asking God to listen comes early on in many of David's laments. The psalm before us is not attributed to David, nor is the request to hear repeated word for word, but each instance shares the idea that God will be inclined to listen, that the human being ought to seek God's attention, and that each supplicant may do so freely and in the company of others. The psalmist is not in danger of drowning, or how could he write, and may not literally be about to die. But many different forms of suffering can feel like a death, from physical ailments to relational estrangements and beyond. In all circumstances, even as far from God as Israelites could imagine, at the bottom of a body of water, we can still call on the Lord. In verse 2, the opening address to the Lord continues with a petition to listen. These two clauses express essentially the same thing, repeating both the sense of the verb hear and the direct object, my voice. This poetic device of synonymous parallelism reinforces the importance the psalmist places on receiving God's full attention. The second clause asks for tangible but unspecified expressions of God's favor. His care begins with listening attentively to the content of the cry and acting to alleviate those specific concerns. As is common in Psalms, we do not know the specific occasion for writing, a feature of the poems that invites us to consider our supplications. Similar language appears several times in Psalms of Lament. Psalms 86, verse 6, 140, verse 6, 143, verse 1. Psalm 28, verse 6, for example, offers a counterpart to the request for God to hear by celebrating that God already had heard. All these Psalms expect that God desires to listen to sincere requests for help and will respond with speed and compassion. We do well to remember, however, that God's timing is not our own. 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 9. And a perceived lack of an answer from God does not mean he has not heard or has no intention of acting. Habakkuk chapter 1 verses 2 through 5, John chapter 11 verses 21 through 22. If you, Lord, keep a record of my sins, Lord, who could stand? The psalmist affirms God's mercy in the form of a question, as if to remind him of his choice to exhibit mercy. God could obsess over human sin to keep meticulous tabs on every stray thought, word, and deed. A similar verb, kept a record, appears in 1 Samuel chapter 1 verse 12, which says that Eli observed Hannah's mouth when she prayed for a son. In the context of 1 Samuel, the verb suggests close attention, as it does here. If God decided to tally sins, no person could be counted as righteous. Psalm 14, verses 2 through 3, Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 20, and Romans chapter 3, verses 10 through 12. Furthermore, a God who rigorously punished all evil immediately would leave no room for human survival. Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 through 7, and chapter 7, verses 21 through 22. But a God who ignored evildoing altogether would cause great harm to humanity. We might consider the fear of God's abandoning his people as exemplified in Lamentations. The God of Israel, however, engages with human beings to reform their lives. Ezekiel chapter 11, verses 19 through 20. The psalmist's question is not merely a theoretical discussion of divine mercy. Mentioning sin also likely touches on the psalmist's reason for writing, to repent of sinful behavior and seek God's forgiveness. The psalmist assumes that God delights in forgiveness and the repair of human life that it makes possible. Ezekiel chapter 33, verse 11, Acts chapter 2, verses 17 through 39. By appealing to God's mercy, the person praying also commits to reform. Romans chapter 2, verse 4. Verses 4 through 6. But with you there is forgiveness, so that we can, with reverence, serve you. I wait for the Lord. My whole being waits. And in his word I put my hope. I wait for the Lord more than watchmen wait for the morning. More than watchmen wait for the morning. but ties this verse closely to verse 3, implying a sequence of closely related events. The experience or even observation of God's forgiveness and its consequences for human life create a sense of awe in the impressionable human. Here, the psalmist's knowledge of God's inclination toward mercy becomes clear, but the sequence of thoughts may seem odd at first. How does the reality of forgiveness create an awe-filled sense of fear? Contrary to the possible view that God's hatred of sin or ferocity toward evil will so terrify people that they will live better lives, this verse suggests that God's mercy towards sinners inspires them to honor Him more. Instead of being mired in sins and paralyzed to choose or do better, forgiveness creates a new path. Isaiah chapter 46, Isaiah chapter 42, verse 16. Divine gentleness with the people inspires awe in part because it seems so different from human inclinations toward one another. In contrast to the pitiless ways in which we often respond to mistreatment or wrongdoing, God exercises mercy. The phrase serve you is absent in older translations. Still, the idea that fear of the Lord leads to service to Him is appropriate. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 13, John chapter 14, verse 15. The Hebrew word translated whole being in verse 5 can more concisely be translated soul, as in the King James Version. But as the new NIV translation suggests, this Hebrew word has a more robust meaning than we might consider in English. Ancient Israelites did not believe in a soul that merely inhabited a body, like Greek thinking. Instead of a divide between body and soul, the Israelites thought of the human being as an integrated whole, a body and soul unity. The soul was the animating force, the piece of the body that made a person alive. This integration of body and soul remains central to Christianity, which rests on the hope of our bodily resurrection. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 50 through 57, rather than the immortality of a disembodied spirit or soul. In saying, my whole being waits, then the psalmist claims to anticipate God's saving work with every fiber of his being. The psalmist's faith involves an orientation to a future in which the problems of the moment find a solution. Psalm 130, verses 5b through 6. The hope here is a synonym for waiting on God. We never hope in vain when we place our hope in His promises. God's word refers here not to the law as it might, but to His promise of salvation given first to Abram, Genesis chapter 12, verses 2 through 3, which becomes the focus of the faithful person's life. Having confidence in that promise shapes behavior for a lifetime as well. Verse 6 repeats, more than watchmen wait for the morning, for rhythmical purposes. We might recognize this convention in our hymns. The repetition also expresses the intensity of waiting for God's saving act. The waiting involves a person's entire being. What this particular phrase means, however, is less than obvious. The emphasis could be on waiting at a specific time during the night, or it could be emphasizing the sentinels who are watching. In either case, an analogy is drawn. Just as nighttime sentries eagerly await the dawn and the relative safety of daytime, so does the one praying wait for a new day in which God will act. Once again, the psalmist's faith requires hope in God's future action. Israel, put your hope in the Lord, for with the Lord is unfailing love, and with him is full redemption. He himself will redeem Israel from all their sins. In the last two verses, the psalm shifts focus from an individual psalmist to the whole community. This sort of shift frequently occurs in psalms of lament, but this one lacks any transition as the psalm turns from the address to God to the address to the people. The hope, especially in God's unfailing love, that the psalmist expressed for his personal circumstances, is prescribed for the gathered community. The Hebrew behind this phrase is difficult to understand and translate. One reason for this is the scarcity of biblical uses of the precise Hebrew word translated redemption. However, the related verb is more common, which gives us confidence that redemption is the appropriate translation here. While we don't often think of it this way, redemption is a legal metaphor. In ancient Israel, the term often applied to the purchase of slaves to free them. The language is prevalent in texts describing God's liberation of the Israelites from Egyptian bondage. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 8, chapter 9, verse 26, chapter 15, verse 15, 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 23, Micah chapter 6, verse 4. Here, however, the liberation does not involve political oppression, or at least not just that, but the oppression of human sin in all its forms. The psalm anticipates God acting to free Israel from sin's power. This redemption is the ultimate fulfillment of God's ancient covenant with the ancestors. As laments often do, the psalm ends with an expression of deep trust in God. Example, Psalm 22. This ending repositions the whole poem because it moves readers from focusing on the individual to God's care for the whole people. In God's great mercy lies hope for Israel and everyone within it. This psalm probably lies behind the promise of the angel to Joseph in Matthew chapter 1, verse 21. You are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. For Matthew, Jesus became the sign and instrument of God's redemption of Israel and to the larger world. There is a tight connection between the individual's experience and the community's proclamation. The people of Israel were the community whom God rescued from evil in all its manifestations, of which we are the spiritual descendants. The people announced and celebrated the good news that such deliverance had occurred. Exodus chapter 15. And they sought more of it. And, of course, that understanding also implies to the church. It applies to the church, the community grafted into Israel. Romans chapters 9 through 11. We also experience, both as individuals and as a community, the power of God's forgiveness, which we imitate in our dealings with others. Thank you so very much for listening. Join me soon for the next audio reading of the lesson with intermittent commentary. Stay safe and may God bless.